Okay, what we're going to do is sort of tear through the 20th century. That's what I would call perceptual or social history. Late 19th century, there's a huge amount of social unrest in much of Europe. In fact, a lot of the 19th century, with urbanization, industrialization, a huge proportion of the populations in Europe are basically sort of disadvantaged, thrown off land, especially true in England. You end up with all sorts of social political movements in the late 19th century, sort of trying to address this. Also true in North America. And the Luddites, one of the most famous early ones, and of course the anarchists in the late 19th, early 20th century being probably the most famous, since they, I think, assassinated 2 American presidents. So what you get is this idea of labor unrest, because what you have is very entrenched, huge amounts of wealth in a very small part of the population. So if you flash on the modern India thing, just kick back 100 years ago, that's Europe and the United States. In some cases, one argues it's the United States going back to that. And so what you get is these political social labor movements become a source of huge concern in Europe and North America, because seen as socially destabilizing, especially for your elites who run the places. Because you have to remember, in much of Europe, you still have monarchies. World War I happens, and basically, huge chunks of the populations are killed off in Europe. And by the time the war is done, one is the monarchies are discredited. So, and many of the monarchies collapse either just before, during, or after the war. Secondly, is one of these anarchist movements picks up steam. Ironically, this is the Russian anarchist movement, led by a guy named Lenin, who then takes on aspects of a political theory generated about 30, 40 years earlier, revamps it, modifies it heavily, and calls it communism, with the idea of communism, where they did that everyone lives communally and shares communally, so you get rid of elites. And so everyone lives in the same social lifestyle. This should sound familiar if you're familiar with the United States in the 60s and 70s. It was sort of the hippie thing, the idea of communal living. Well, they call themselves Bolsheviks, but the Bolshevik communism movement ends up ending up controlling Russia. They become the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union is based on its original political premise, is based on this idea of communism. And once the Bolsheviks gain control in Russia, they then try to export this very aggressively throughout the rest of the world. And so post World War I, what you find is, especially in Europe and North America, especially the United States, is they've just ended a world war. And now they've got this threat of social, economic, political destabilization from this new political sort of social movement, which really seeks to destroy their system and replace it with this communism, the Bolsheviks. And they're usually termed Bolsheviks. There's a huge pushback. The pushback in part is why Hitler comes to power in Nazi Germany. But this occurs throughout Europe, and it's important to remember that's one reason why the Nazi Party was so popular in Europe and the United States, is because it was seen as a response to the threat of communism. World War II comes around, and ironically, the Soviet Union, i.e. the communists, end up on the same side as the Western Europeans, the Americans, and so they end up, together in World War II against Nazi Germany and Italy. So the end result of when the war's finished is that for the Europeans, it was almost like a timeout, because the Europeans are as paranoid, if not more paranoid, after World War II, because now the Soviet Union is one of the major military powers on the planet. They were largely responsible for wiping out Nazi Germany. And so now they're a military threat. They're not just a political threat. They don't have a different ideology. Now they have guns to back it. And so for the British, especially at the end of World War II, they were firmly convinced that when World War II ended, you'd end up with World War II.5, which would be the Western Europeans, the British, French, Americans fighting the Soviet Union. And in fact, a lot of German units at the end of World War II, when they surrender to the British and the Americans, they basically ask if they can keep their weapons and their tanks, because they figure everyone's going to go fight Russia next. So World War II ends, but for most folks, including the Soviet Union, Stalin was then not opposed to making it World War II and a half. So what you get is, in a weird way, World War II sort of ends, but no one was really sure it had ended. Now this very quickly morphs into what's usually called the Cold War, where everyone decides, well, let's not shoot each other today, but they still get ready to shoot each other tomorrow. By the mid-late 1940s, the paranoia in the United States towards communism, Bolshevism, was even higher than it had been earlier. And so what happens is that the anti-communist movement, I think sometimes called the McCarthy era, you have to go Google it, is a sort of trying to control communism. And this sort of becomes the Cold War mantra in the West. The Europeans and the Americans, what becomes NATO, for example, is the idea of controlling communism becomes their logic. In the 1930s, the Soviets, when they were trying to export communism, contacted some of your 1920s, actually contacted some of your intellectuals in China that were opposed to the current political system there and brought them in and trained them. So we end up with a group of Chinese who take on Bolshevism or communism. Now, they're very quickly reinterpreted. So communism in Soviet Union is not the same as communism in communist China, because the Chinese completely revamp how it works, how it's supposed to work, and what it's supposed to be, which actually pisses off the Russians really bad, which is why the Russians and Chinese didn't like each other in the 20th century at all. So World War II shows up, and of course in China, that means 1936 through 1937. The communists pretty much control northern China. The Kuomintang, or regular Chinese government, controls all the rest of China. The Kuomintang is spectacularly ineffective in dealing with the Japanese. In the north, largely because of their guerrilla techniques and stuff like that, the communists are actually doing a pretty good job of, keeping the Japanese who have invaded all of China pretty much on one foot. And so by 1944, in other words, the latter part of World War II, the British, but especially the Americans, are actually working with the communist Chinese and actually see them being the most effective government in China because they're doing the most to fight the Japanese. And of course, the communist Chinese are getting some support from the Soviet Union, i.e. Russia, but that's sort of limited because already the Russians are rather cynically displeased with the fact that the Chinese, fiddled with their game plan for political system, since the Soviet Union game plan was sort of that China would become part of the Soviet Union, which might sound sort of familiar if you've been listening to Putin the last couple of days. So in that situation, World War II ends. Japan surrenders. Let me back up. Japan and Russia had actually been at war with each other. The Soviet Union and Japan actually go into this huge conflict in 1939 called the Nomonhan Incident. The Japanese get their butts handed to them. They get the part of an entire army just sort of massacred out there in Mongolia. And the end result is the Japanese decide, well, this isn't worth picking a fight with the Soviet Union. The Soviets are glad because, of course, within a year they get invaded by the Nazis. So they have a peace treaty. But the Japanese actually keep almost a quarter of their entire global military on the border with the Soviet Union because they don't trust the Soviet Union any further they can throw it. The Soviets, on the other hand, really don't care what the Japanese are up to because they're deathly afraid that the Nazis are going to take over all of Russia. So this sort of persists through late World War II. Near the end of World War II, Russia's, they've won, they've wiped the Nazis out, and they're then looking to the east and sort of thinking two things. One is, we don't need the Japanese, and we don't need to be nice to the Japanese. There's pressure from the Americans, especially, that the Soviet Union should attack Japan, though the Americans wanted to do it earlier, not surprisingly. And the Soviet Union are like, I don't think so. So we're now into 1945. The Soviet Union takes a huge chunk of its army that was in Europe that had just fought the Nazis, runs them by rail, which was an amazing feat, plops them down the border with Japan. And when they hear that the Americans are doing, getting ready to invade southern Japan, Kyushu, they decide that they need to get into this before they get cut out of the action. So what they do is they invade the northern part. So this section here was part of Japan. These are called the Sakhalins. The Soviet Union attacks the Japanese, who of course had controlled everything here. Korea was part of Japan. All of China, basically through the center section, was part of Japan. And of course, these islands were. And so what the Soviet Union does is they just invade. They just come storming across the border. And in what was actually the most spectacular and probably the most effective military campaign in the 20th century, in the space of less than 2 weeks, they took over almost a third of this entire area up here, and they take over the entire Sakhalin Island chain. And they get ready to invade Hokkaido. This was actually one of the major factors for the Japanese surrender in World War II, because the Soviets made it very clear to the Japanese when they attacked, they weren't taking prisoners. So when they invade the Sakhalins, they genocide everyone, pretty much. And when they get ready to invade Hokkaido, they tell the Japanese, we're going to genocide everyone there too. We don't see any advantage to having Japanese around, so we're just getting rid of them, replace them with Russians. And given the fact that Stalin had already done that in a bunch of other places, he wasn't bullshitting, it was the truth. So the Japanese are looking at Russian genocide from their Soviet genocide in the north that's going to come down and clean the Japanese islands completely clear of Japanese. At the same time, the Americans are starting to drop nuclear weapons. And the combination of those two events was why Japan surrendered, not just the nuclear weapons. Their fear of being wiped out by the Soviets, who had absolutely no compunction at just erasing the Japanese from the face of the planet, led them to realize that this war was not survivable. And so they surrender. Now, because this surrender occurs unexpectedly, and you have to remember at the same time, this is months after the wars ended over here. So you have all the Europeans over here are thinking the Soviet Union is going to invade, or they're going to invade the Soviet Union. So you have World War II getting ready to start here. And over on this side, what you have is suddenly the Japanese empire has collapsed, and the Russians are taking over big chunks of it, all the way basically down to here, almost to Beijing. And so the Americans and the British especially go into a panic, because you have to remember their view is the Soviet Union was not much better than the Japanese. And in fact, in many ways, they're more afraid of the Soviet Union because the Japanese, they pretty much had beaten into the ground. But the Soviet Union was, by then the world's largest military, and probably, and certainly one of the best, especially after the stunning campaign in Siberia and Manchuria. So the end result of all this is the Americans and Brits figure, we got to do something. So what they do is several things. One of the first they do is they decide to stop the Soviets. And so they use the threat of Soviets not wanting to attack the Western Europeans right off the bat. So they fly troops into various spots. They fly troops into Beijing, for example. The Americans fly some airborne troops into Seoul. And they fly troops, of course, the Americans immediately fly troops into much of Japan, including Hokkaido, as quickly as possible to forestall the Soviets coming down and just taking over these areas now the Japanese have surrendered. The Soviets have basically taken over everything through here in Northern Korea. The minute the Japanese surrender, the Soviets come down at about 9 million miles an hour with the idea that what they want to take over is the whole Korean peninsula in this northern part of China, and they're going to make it into part of the Soviet Union. That's hugely important to the Soviets because that gives them freshwater ports, that gives them warm water ports, because the Soviet Union basically is landlocked. But if they had control of this area, they now would have access to the ocean, Pacific specifically. And so they really want this, and they don't see anything in their way. The Americans basically draw a line in the sand right around the city of Seoul, put troops in and tell the Soviets, if you come down here, we'll shoot at you. So, do you want to start World War III or not? And the Soviets decide it's not worth it. The economy's shot, and they need to sort of think about this. And so they start to come to a halt with both sides sort of looking at each other like with a line drawn in the sand. World War II ends, the United Nations starts to form, and everyone figures out, okay, what's the world going to look like now? What happens is when they're looking at the Korean Peninsula, they basically take I think it was an old National Geographic map, some goofy little map out of an atlas. And they basically draw a line across the middle. And they say, okay, to the south, this is the American influence area. To the north, this is a Soviet influenced area. Now, by this time, what's happened is the Soviets have pretty much got their, the Chinese communists pretty much control this northern part of China. And so this is sort of under Soviet influence too. So as far as the Russians are concerned, at the end of World War II, they basically control all of this area, what's now North Korea, and this huge chunk of northern China is under Soviet influence, and so is Mongolia. And of course, at this point, they've also swallowed all these islands to the north. They start sniffing around the idea of taking Hokkaido, but then again, the Americans have enough troops there that they don't want, it's not worth starting World War III about. Taking over France or Germany might be worth World War III, but taking over a northern Japanese island or taking part of the Korean Peninsula isn't worth getting into another world war about. And so everyone just sort of backs off. But at that point, what you end up is this fear of communism now expands because, of course, you've got two groups of communists. You've got the Soviet Union communists, and from the American, especially the American, much less the European standpoint, you've also got the Chinese communists. And of course, by 1949, the Chinese communists have taken over all of China. The Kuomintang or the other, the Chiang Kai-shek party that was controlling all of China falls apart like a paper, box. ends up ditching China, ends up, of course, on the island of Taiwan as a failed government of China. So rather than surrendering, what they do is they move everything to Taiwan, which is still the Republic of China. The Chinese communists take over all of China, which is the People's Republic of China, which is why they call it People's Communism. So by 1949, the American paranoia is shot up even further because you have the huge military, this enormous expanse of property here. That's the Soviet Union, which you have to remember included all this area here, and including all the Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, etc. You have North Korea, and then of course, then you've got the Chinese communists, which can control over this. So if you're American or European, but especially American, you're prone to paranoia. You're looking at, you basically suddenly see, what seems like a huge chunk of the planet is now communist. And that's where the paranoia that was the United States, in the 50s and 60s, and this is the basis of the Cold War, is this fear of what the communists are going to do or what the communists could do. And the need to make sure that doesn't happen. And that basically pushes the United States into becoming a superpower. And of course, what also happens then is the Soviet Union decides that it's going to counter that because the Russians, as we mentioned earlier, have a huge chunk of paranoia. So they don't see the attitude as being legit, but they certainly understand the aggression or the potential aggression. So they respond ironically with more aggression. And so what you end up is the Soviet Union vis-a-vis the United States as the two superpowers. Now you end up with the Europeans sort of as players on the side, that would be NATO. And you also end up, of course, with the Chinese communists as players on the side, sort of pro, but also anti-Russia. I mean, you have to remember that China and Russia get into 3 shooting matches between the 1950s and 1970s about shared borders because they share a long border here. And there's a lot of disagreement between them even today about which part of it should be mine and which part of it should be yours. So that never gets resolved. It still has been resolved as of 2022. So that's the Cold War. Now, the key part that impacts what we're looking at right now is that when the Cold War becomes central, then all of a sudden the Americans and the Europeans, but especially the Americans, sort of forget about World War II. And this is why, as I mentioned before, Japan doesn't have to apologize for World War II because the American paranoia about communist China is so great, and their fear of communist China is they basically tell Japan, hey, you guys were bad guys. Now it's a real bad thing to do, but we hung a few people, we punished a few people. So let's just let bygones be bygones, and let's make sure you stay American friends so that this region doesn't turn communist. And this basically drives American foreign policy for the next 30 or 40 years. That's why the Americans end up in Vietnam, for example, and all throughout Southeast Asia. That's why the Americans end up, basically sort of semi-controlling the Philippines right till about 15 years ago, is this paranoia about communist China, with the idea that communist China and the communist Russia, the USSR, are a package deal, which of course they weren't. They had very little in common and didn't even like each other. In that context, what you also get then is our current players, because Japan then becomes a interesting situation because Japan, basically what's now called the home islands, has to basically reinvent itself and sort of bring itself back from destruction. 98% of the Japanese urban areas were destroyed by the end of World War II from firebombing. Not nuclear weapons, but just literally burning the entire cities to the ground. There were almost no urban areas left in all of Japan. The road system was destroyed. The rail system was destroyed. Unlike in Europe, where there was a move to provide economic and social support in Europe because you didn't want them to become communist. Post-World War II, and no one cares about Japan. And so what happens is the Japanese have to basically bring themselves up. They have to bootstrap themselves up from nothing. Just like they did in the late 19th century, they do the whole thing all over again in the 1950s and 60s. And amazingly enough, they do exactly the same thing all over again. They turn themselves from a completely wiped out country into one of the regional powers in less than 30 years. It's an astonishing performance, especially because in this second situation, there's not a large military involved. Now, next to them, what you have is this area that was split apart. The Soviet, i.e. the Russian influence to the north, the American influence to the south. By 1946-47, the United States is tired of World War II. We've got nuclear weapons, so the idea of stuff on the ground is not a big deal for Americans. And so what you get is all of a sudden the war fades out. People don't want to think about wars. They want to just forget the whole thing. And so the American influence in East Asia is pretty much almost non-existent. There's a few American troops in Korea, supporting Taiwan against the Chinese communist quotes, and of course Japan. But it's no one's paying any attention to it. It's not relevant. All the American interest, if there's any, is almost entirely internal in the United States. And again, that goes to this McCarthy thing. But also, if there is any other interest, it's back in Europe, just like it had been for the last couple of hundred years. Having said that, what you get then is there's a dictatorship, the re-dictatorship in South Korea. So it's a dictatorship under American sponsorship, very much like you see in Vietnam at the same time. In North Korea, what you have is the dictatorship there, the Kim dictatorship under Soviet sponsorship, not the Chinese communists, but the Russians. Neither side's paying a lot of attention. Again, the Soviet Union, like their American counterparts, had a lot of other, irons in the fire. And then again, Korea was not even on their chart of top 20 things to worry about. And so what happens is everyone's not paying attention to this area. North Korea gets access to Russian military weaponry and training. And basically, once the Japanese had left, since they controlled this area with a brutal hand up to 1945, the North Koreans decided that what really should happen is Korea should become one country again. Koreans are one ethnic group. There's only one language, one culture there. And so the North Korean government, this dictatorship, decides it should take over South Korea from this dictatorship. And so they unilaterally invade South Korea in 1950. Now, South Korea has a very small military. It was very disorganized, and the dictatorship was so corrupt, it was almost like a game. It was hard to believe it was real. And of course, the Americans had a few troops there. So all of a sudden, sort of like one morning, hundreds of thousands of North Korean troops pour across the border into South Korea. And in a very, very short period of time, within a couple of weeks, they take over all of South Korea with the exception of the area around Busan, the port. Americans are wiped out. South Korean military is pretty much wiped out. And most ironically, what happens is the Soviet Union's caught totally by surprise. The North Korean dictatorship didn't tell anyone. They didn't tell the Chinese communists who they were buddies with. And they didn't tell the Soviet Union they were going to do this. Both groups are really pissed off at them doing this unilaterally. And North Korea's attitude of the Kim administration is like, well, it's our country, do we want to? But to the Europeans and especially the Americans, this is another move of communism to take over Asia and eventually end up in San Francisco or something like that. So what they do is there's an immediate response by the Americans first, but then they go to the United Nations and get the United Nations to basically declare North Korea the enemy of the world, if you want to think of it that way. Now, the Soviet Union could have stopped this in the Security Council, but the Soviet Union wasn't there that day. Their general argument is, well, they weren't knew what was going to happen. I think that's probably partially true, but I think they also were so pissed off at the North Koreans, they sort of said, well, fine, you bring whatever, you brought this on yourself. So the communists don't back North Korea in the United Nations. So by 1950, what you get is the United Nations is at war with North Korea, not the United States, not the Europeans, the United Nations. The Soviet Union and, well, it's Chinese communists, I think they were in the United Nations by then, don't have anything to do with it. They don't support it, but they weren't there to veto it. And so what happens is the military forces start to expand, especially American military forces start to expand. They then eventually take over all of South Korea, and under MacArthur, the overall commander, they then go all the way to the border with China and take over all of North Korea within almost like 5 miles of the border. MacArthur, who was sort of a loose cannon anyways, then goes on public press, both radio and I guess it must have been movies, I don't think TV then, and it says that basically what they're going to do is, because the Chinese communists had sort of supported North Korea, what he wants to do is nuclear weapon and basically nuke all the large cities in China and then invade China and get rid of the communists. MacArthur had just a total thing about hating communism. And so he sees this, he's got this big army, basically he's just going to go and take over China. Not surprising, the Chinese don't particularly thrilled when this guy who's the supreme commander of all the military forces of the United Nations in this area says he's going to nuke all the major Chinese cities like Beijing, Shanghai, etc., and then invade. So their attitude is, well, dude, that means you're actually going to do it. The United States government under Truman actually then disavows MacArthur and then fires his butt, but it's too late. At that point, the Chinese communists decide, well, this war is not going to end with the two Koreas. And so hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops are poured into North Korea to support North Korea. Now, the Soviets stay out of the whole thing. They're just like shaking their heads, wondering, like, what the hell? So the North Koreans / Chinese reinvade, take over all of North Korea, take over about 2/3 again of South Korea. So almost back to where we were about a year and a half earlier. The United Nations forces regroup. And by late 1951, early 1952, the war stops right where it started. The boundary between North Korea and South Korea pretty much is within 5 or 10 miles of where it was before the initial invasion in 1950. At that point, the Chinese just sort of back out because the war sort of stalemates. The Americans are there, the North Koreans are here. The Chinese are providing support, but they'd send their troops back home. And so what ends is the Korean War doesn't end. In 1953, there's a truce signed between North Korea and the United Nations, and that basically neither side will invade the other till they can come up with a permanent agreement. Well, folks, I hate to tell you this, but it's 2022 and the truce is still in place. There is no agreement. North Korea is still at war with the world. This is why North Koreans act so weird, or the North Korean government acts so weird. They have a right to be paranoid. The United Nations still has a declaration of war against North Korea. North Korea's only buddies. By the end of this whole thing, they pissed off the Soviets. I mean, the Russians so bad, the Russians don't have anything to do with them. They just drop them. Now, the Russians have their major seaport and their major cities here just north in Vladivostok. So the North Koreans' main border is with China. And the Chinese communists don't trust the North Koreans. They think they're a loose cannon, but they don't know what to do about it because they can't destabilize the whole Chinese economy and political system with maybe millions of North Korean refugees as the whole system goes south. So from 1953 on, China becomes the big brother of North Korea. The United States becomes the big brother of South Korea. And that's still the situation in 2022. This is technically still a shooting war that's been now going on for, 70 years, over 70 years. Shows no signs of abating. This is why North Korea likes to flip off missiles just to irritate everyone. And this is also why communist China they're very quiet about North Korea because they basically just would wish the whole problem would just cease to exist. But there's no way they can do that given the fact they share this huge border, and it would just make an enormous nightmare for the Chinese. So, everyone just doesn't know what to do with all this. Now, this was pretty much the state of affairs then. The United States became the great sort of anti-enemy of communist China. The United States ends up then backing Taiwan. With the end of the Korean War, I should say with the hiatus of the Korean War, the United States realizes it sort of has issues in Asia. And so the United States starts to expand its military operations in Asia. This is one reason why the United States gets again drawn into Vietnam with the idea of stopping what they see as communist expansionism into Southeast Asia. And that's sort of the situation now. Communist China had pretty much by the 1980s had realized it couldn't do its own thing. And so it rejoined the world order, became a major power. And right now it's one of the other superpowers, probably most so in the Soviet Union because it has economic backing of it. When Xi Jinping, the current head of the Chinese government, comes to power about 15 years ago, he rechanges that policy very much in the way that Putin rechanged the policy for Russia. Both of them look to reestablishing themselves as the great world powers. China was a regional power in economic. It's been the world's major economic power for the last 4 or 5 years. But Xi Jinping isn't happy with that. He wants China to also be the big military political power in at least all the Asian region. And so China now has the world's largest navy. China has I'm pretty sure they must have the world's largest army. And they're actually using it. They're using it against the Indians with a border with India. They're 1 week away from invading Taiwan. They're just getting very, very aggressive. And ironically, what's happened with that is, again, your other powers that were big in the 19th, early 20th century, Japan, has remobilized. And now Japan's also got one of the world's largest militaries, especially Navy, in counter to the Chinese. The Koreans are building up their military. South Korea, North Korea has one of the world's largest militaries also. So, if you add all these groups together, you've got all these huge militaries. In most cases, especially with the Korean situation, still is basically shoot to kill, orders going. And with the rest of this region, on one mistake away from a world war. Now you combine this then with the Soviet Union, which collapses in 1991. Putin comes to power, about 10 years after that. And his big dream ever since then is basically to reconstitute the USSR, which would be to take back everything to Poland here, take Finland, which they took in 1939, and take all this area down to the south, which has huge oil and mineral reserves. Sort of rebuild the USSR the way it was in, say, 1940. And in that context, ironically, what happens is they and the Chinese are not buddies because if the Russians get what they want, then if you notice, there's now a almost 1,500-mile border here with communist China, plus the border here in Siberia with communist China. And of course, in the 1930s, this whole northern part of China belonged to the Soviet Union. So on one hand, to the West still, I think everyone sees the Soviet Union and communist China as being a package deal, but they're not. They don't trust each other. They've shot at each other frequently. And right now they're pretending to be buddies because it pisses everyone else off, but they're not buddies. And this is sort of the current state of affairs. It's pretty surrealistic in most of the planet. The huge difference compared to say 100 years ago or even 50 years ago is the vast amount of production in most of the world. Most of the stuff that you buy, especially in the United States, you go to Target, to Walmart, or any place like that, you find a huge part of what we buy production-based is from China and this particular part of basically the area surrounded by the East China Sea. This is the area the Chinese are most aggressive about wanting to control. The Chinese are making really goofy arguments that they should control all the South China Sea because they had an admiral 500 years ago sail through here, which is seriously lame. But the end result is because now we're willing to back up the world's largest military, is everyone and their brothers getting tremendously paranoid about that. Because if the Chinese control this, they basically control all of world trade. And so the Chinese are coming from a very different standpoint than the Soviet Union. Putin wants to reestablish the USSR for reasons of, who knows what. Xi Jinping wants to reestablish what he sort of sees as Qing or Tang Dynasty China for the purpose of global economic and military control based on the ability to control world resources and world traffic, especially, economic traffic in Asia. So they've got very different agendas, very different goals, and they're not necessarily mutually supporting. In fact, in many ways, they're in competition with each other. So that's sort of the world in 2022. And, depending on who you're listening to, if you listen, I read the South China Morning Post, for example, the Hong Kong newspaper, and, their view or the Asahi Shimbun, the Japanese newspapers, are as China's the great threat. And of course, the United States sees that too, especially with our Pacific Command based here in Pearl Harbor. On the other hand, of course, right now with Ukraine, et cetera, you've got Finland, among other places. You've got the Soviet Union now / Russia as the great threat. That's not an either or, it's both. And one of the huge issues in world order right now in 2022 is trying to figure out how you reduce the threat level, how you reduce the crisis level, probably in East Asia, because you can't have two types of world crises like this simultaneously. Someone's going to screw up, someone's going to press a button, something's going to go wrong. So you've got to find some way to lower the heat level, if you would, in East Asia. And no one knows how to do that right now. And especially as of today, everyone's so distracted by the Ukraine, I don't know that anyone's thinking about it. I'm sure some folks are. So that's sort of East Asia. Japan's a major world economic power, but they're also, in the last 10 years, very specifically becoming, and rather aggressively becoming one of the major military powers globally. China is the other great military power, and in many cases probably is the world's largest military power in 2022. Russia is right behind them, although their Navy is pretty pitiful. You've got a lot of players here with a lot of toys, and it's real hard to get everyone to sort of calm down and say, let's not shoot off stuff. Let's just sort of hang around, especially with North Korea. Of course, you've got sort of the random element in the whole deck.